Hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Today I am the moderator and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker from today, Szymon Skalski. He is a PhD candidate at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. His academic pursuits have resulted in a number of publications and conference presentations spanning the fields of artificial intelligence, insurance, cybersecurity, and tort law. He's a member of expert groups and professional bodies affiliated with key national institutions such as the Ministry of Digital Affairs and the Polish Bank Association. In addition, he contributes to international cybersecurity efforts through his participation in NATO's locked field cyber defense exercises. So today he will talk a bit about us at the mechanisms for liability and compensation arising from private threats in the space. Thank you.
Hello everybody. I'm never writing that again. And the next time I'm writing just my name and surname. It sounded much more modest when I was writing it. Sorry. Okay. Sorry first for the confusion, because the topic on the flyer that was distributed is wrong. It's my fault. Don't worry. Mostly it is the fault of Professor Matthew Gaska from Cali, because we changed the topic a bit after the discussion, so that's his fault mostly, not mine. We narrowed the issue down a lot, because originally the research was meant to be like broadly about compensation for warfare related, for hybrid warfare related issues in cyberspace, in space. And we narrowed it down to what I think is one of the most interesting cases that can occur currently, and which did occur many times in the recent years. And this is it is interestingly tied to what Patricia talked about last week, because those are to some extent like either self-induced blackouts on the Starlink part, or like a third-party induced blackouts of the internet in US and in Ukraine. The main research question is that what losses arise when Starlink is deliberately restricted or unintentionally disrupted in the US and Ukraine between 2022 and 2025, and given those losses arose, what realistic compensation pathways exist and for whom? That is like the main thing I want to check. What is my like initial conclusion, was also like a thesis for this research, is that there is a liability gap for most civilian users. The remedy funnel narrows to credit refunds, hardware swaps, or like suboptimal ways of compensation. The only place where the compensation is more real, that can be considered like a serious compensation for losses that occurred because of the blackout, is the procurement process, especially like a government level procurement, where we have like separate agreements, SLAs, and everything, where Starlink promises the certain levels of service that it will be delivered with, like, for example, 99.9% of a given time. So yeah, I distinguish international policy limits from unintentional technical failures, and I analyze the issue in those two areas. So US on the one side and Ukraine on the other. Those are the two most interesting ones for me. Also, there is very important and interesting link between those, because some of the US blackouts, like worldwide blackouts, were happening also in Ukraine, while Ukraine also had their own specific blackouts, like only for their situation. Why is that important? Starlink as a service became much more essential, especially in those weirdly similar areas, which are especially like looking from the perspective of how Starlink is used. One is like US households, especially in remote areas, and Ukrainian front lines. The similar thing is for those two situations is that a single private network can be either geofenced or just fail because of different reasons, which will be analyzed later. Can just fail on a whim, basically, and there is no legal avenue of seeking compensation for those cases. The governance problem is not just reliability, but also discretion. There are huge problems, especially on the agreement level, of the contract level, between the users and Starlink, on the continuity part. It all comes, in my opinion, to this question which I mentioned yesterday, that in this case, this question, like who pays when the sky goes dark, when the internet is turned off, how private contracts and how this relationship between private users and Starlink allocates the risk between the actors, and whether there should be any regulatory intervention similar to regulatory intervention that we know from today's and how they function nowadays. The most important one, just to like clarify this issue, for example, telecommunication providers, it differs a lot in different countries. But for example, in US, the telecommunication providers are obliged to maintain 911 as a possibility to call for like an emergency, despite all of those different issues, like for example, someone not paying their bills or everything, you can still call 911. It's very similar in Europe under different telecommunication regulations. Starlink is not obliged under none of those regulations, while at the same time it has become one of the most important part of like a crisis management, especially if we look at Ukraine and remote areas in different parts of the world. I think that there is a knowledge gap in that regard, that we don't really know what situations can happen, what are different possibilities of a blackout, because there are many different ones, and what happens after the blackout and what caused the blackout creates completely different legal background, legal landscape for different types of losses. So that's one thing to do, to map all of those different situations that can cause blackouts, and all of the different types of losses that can happen in different scenarios. That would not be that much that would be more for like a governmental mapping than a research paper. Then the question is, on the basis of that mapping, what should we do about it? Should we treat private internet providers as entities that carry some level of like public responsibility for example, emergency coverage, for example, for like a military usage? We can see that on one hand, of course, we can say that this is like a Starlink is just an example, but this is like a private company that should be able to sign any agreement they want. Also, however, when we look at, for example, like Ukraine cases, there were huge US government pushes to oblige Starlink to provide a certain level of services, apart from like Pentagon people saying that what Starlink did in Ukraine is like eye-watering, and it is like very, very important thing that they did. There were also pushes to sign like a DoD agreements to maintain certain level of service provision. This is basically what I said earlier. There are a lot of problems on the technical part. I will divide them into US context and Ukraine context in a second. What we encounter on a legal basis are what I will talk about a lot today, which is customer terms and what is in the terms of service of Starlink, like a model agreement they sign. Also, there are many other problems like later down the road. There are problems in tort liability, of course, apart from it being limited by the agreement itself. Even if it wasn't limited, there will be problems with like economic loss rule and those types of issues. On the insurance level, both from the perspective of Starlink and the perspective of users, we encounter what I think ties nicely with like cybersecurity part of this research, because we encounter very common problems that ties with cyber insurance. So for example, like this physical loss problem, so like identifying whether the loss was physical or it wasn't. And especially, which is in my opinion one of the biggest problems now, is war exclusions. So insurers excluding liability because of war related issues. And as we can see, like with Starlink, especially in Ukraine, like everything can be said that it's tied to war-like event, like armed conflict tied events. So yeah, that's like common problems that are present also in this research. Okay, so going into more specific issues across this time period, which I've chosen 2022 to 2025. We had a couple major outages in US. One of the major ones was the nationwide outage in May 2024, which interrupted services for an hour. Later, we had a global software failure in late July 2025, which was by far the biggest outage there was. For I think there was like 60,000 complaints noted for that one. It cut connectivity for 2 to 3 hours and generated tens of thousands of reports. There were also like multi-state disruptions because of that, and that's what will be covered in the Ukraine case, because this is the outage that also affected other states, especially Ukraine, in the context of war. In all of those cases, SpaceX acknowledged the incident, restored services quite promptly. Actually, there were no like major outages, for example, for like days or weeks. It usually was back in a couple hours. However, in any of those cases, because those are just examples, there were more shorter outages. In none of those cases there was any sort of compensation apart from fixing the problem itself. Or small cases, which I will talk about later, of FCC, I think, complaints that cost, like Reddit users saying that they got compensation only after filing like a public complaint through FCC, the informal complaint, and then Starlink compensated them to some extent. They gave them new equipment and gave the like a lowered fare for the next months, but there's no like regular monetary compensation. So from those US cases, what losses can arise? First, of course, economic losses. So our internet outages interrupt revenue, of course. Things like work product, things like businesses just operating regularly based on the internet, where they cannot operate in like a normal manner. Overtime, rescheduling, and all of those issues usually come without compensation beyond those like credit mechanism that gives the reduced fare for like a month or something. The regular mechanism in Starlink agreement is that we get back our fee for a month, which, like, by comparison, if we lose, for example, in those couple hours, we can lose tens of thousands of dollars of money if we, for example, are a big ISP or something like that. And if we pay, for example, like $110 for a month for a service, we will, for those 6 months, for example, we'll get only $660 for each month. The other type of damages are operational disruptions, of course, so a bit more like a high level harms that can occur. Things tied to remote work, telehealth session, which we are getting in like a more scary territory with things like, for example, telehealth sessions, cloud-based solutions stalled, compliance of service level obligations are missed if we have those timers, and because of those compliance timelines missed, we can have like a downstream penalties after that. Another avenue are safety and welfare risk. So loss of connectivity degrades the access to emergency information, telemedicine, connected security system, and coordination during severe weather or disasters. We saw also Starlink being used as a solution during like natural crises. So in those cases, like an outage can cause severe harms to civilians, to populace. Even those, which is very important in that case, in many cases, especially in cases of like war, like event or natural disasters, it doesn't matter if you are a Starlink customer or not. Like if the system is based on Starlink, you will get harmed because of an outage on the Starlink part, even though you're not a user of Starlink, which is not really the case. It can be like a third-party issue, but it's not that important in the previous two areas. In the safety and welfare risks, if we talk about it, it doesn't really matter if you are a customer or not. The other part, this is maybe a more like a minor issue. So the fact that in the case of an outage, we probably will have to switch to other means of accessing the internet, like improvised hotspots, public networks, which can cause privacy and data exposure. And of course, the last part is on the Starlink part, so reputational and relational harm. As we saw in the majority of the outages, the Elon Musk himself spoke up and went and addressed publicly the outages, said he's sorry and everything. So this is like a very high level issue when the Starlink goes dark. The other part of events, the other like section of cases we have is Ukraine. One is similar. So when we had those global outages of Starlink, it also affected Ukraine. However, there were some cases of outages that were very specific to Ukrainian to trench warfare situation. One of those types of scenarios where when Russians were jamming the signals, especially in the early 2022. There were short-lived degradations in the quality of SpaceX. SpaceX on its own mitigated that with software changes, which was like also, in my opinion, it was probably prompted by US government because it was also very highly praised by US government after those changes were made to software. Later, we changed the approach completely and the scene completely because in early 2023, the SpaceX publicly curbed Starlink use for offensive drone control and limited the ability of Ukrainian forces to use SpaceX internet, especially by limiting like the high frequency access, which is like important, which is key in operation of like of drones, especially on this like video being sent from a drone to the operator. That's when we need this like high frequency latency of the internet, and that's what was mainly targeted by the SpaceX itself. And yeah, so we can see that we have a couple groups of outages that can happen. They can happen out of nowhere because of, for example, things like software problems, which were the case in the early US cases of outages. We can see that there is like a third actor that can cause those outages, but by for example, jamming of the signal. But also probably this is also like always like a possibility, especially if we look at space incidents from the last years, where, for example, Russia shut down their own satellite because it was old and faulty, and they left the debris in the space, which was like a whole international issue. But it shows that there are possibilities of shooting down satellites, and Starlinks, of course, can be a target as well. Also, of course, adding to that under current international humanitarian law consensus, at least to what I know, SpaceX satellites supplying internet to Ukraine can be considered like a valid military targets because they are aiding in a military pursuit of Ukraine. So this is another group. Of course, we can have issues caused by Starlink itself, which it's hard to call those issues. That's something like business decisions not to supply internet, which is supported highly by the provisions I will talk about in a second, which are in the agreement. And of course, we can have problems on the user end caused by a user because of some like not understanding how the technology works on or distraction or mishandling of the equipment itself. We talked about that mostly. So like losses of Starlink in Ukraine are like harms done by damage to Starlink connection in Ukrainian context. Of course, consists of those we spoke about in US mostly. But to that, we have to add all of this like strategic, operational, and tactical military context of impeding things like command and control, different communication systems. In Ukraine, like analyzing the narrative of Ukrainian forces, we can see like an evolution from like a very enthusiastic approach to Starlink to being much more limited in that enthusiasm, being a bit more reserved, because at the early stages of the war there was a huge reliance, especially in those very important drone forces of Ukraine. There was a huge reliance on Starlink, and especially after those Starlink-induced outages or limitations in the use of drones for offensive purposes, we saw a much more reserved approach to that because it's not that reliable as once thought. Okay. And for the agreement, what I did, I analyzed the whole thing provision by provision. I tried to mapping the provisions of Starlink agreement to these like bigger issues that are important for non-lawyers, to try to exclude from this whole long agreement those parts that are important. And in my opinion, what is the most important part to understand for lawyers and non-lawyers from this agreement is what Starlink can do. And for the first thing, Starlink can change plans, prices, hardware, and terms with at least 1 month's notice for materially adverse changes, and they can do it on a whim whenever it's needed. There is a 12-month service commitment, which can include a free kit, and changing plans mid-terms or canceling can trigger a $3 to $5 fee. And this is a difference between like paying monthly and paying for 12 months, which is, I think that's one of 2 or 3 most important parts. Everything in the agreement, which covers both service and the kit, is provided as is. So Starlink is not liable for any faults and problems with that, because that's how it works. It's not Starlink is not obliged to provide the service on a certain level. We don't have an SLA in the like a regular agreement. Consequential damages are excluded. Total liability is capped as this is what I spoke of earlier. The total liability is capped at fees paid in the prior 6 months. We have like it's limited on every potential compensation avenue, because first we are limited only to what we paid in our as our like fee for using. And also this is capped to only what we paid in the last 6 months to the disruption. Starlink may suspend or terminate for policy violations, non-payment, legal or security reasons, or for convenience with notice. And also it can terminate due to governmental order, which is also important in this like war and crisis scenario. What's important from like a legal perspective, we can't go to court with that, because disputes must go to individual arbitration committees in the US under Texas law, and we can't have class actions and class arbitrations waived. They are waived. which is also very important, especially in those like natural disaster scenarios where we could have potentially many plaintiffs, and we just in that situation we can't. One thing that is interesting, which I read a bit at this stage, are those higher level plans that we can buy as, for example, like a government agency or like a big company, and there we have SLAs. So it changes a lot, and of course it also is like a sociological thing that the worst deal is being like an individual consumer in terms of the level of the service you are getting. Because if you can pay for those higher tier plans, you will get SLA, which will say, for example, that the service will be provided with like 99% accuracy. On the lower levels, we don't have anything to grab and to sue on the basis of contractual liability towards Starlink. Yeah, that's what I basically said. Yeah, this is this Reddit complaint history of a person who couldn't get any support or compensation from Starlink only after SSC complaint got basically what was stated in the agreement, that it will be provided to this person. Yeah, and that's all. I think I fit in the time limit. This is an early to mid stage of the research. At this point, the goal is to create very comprehensive mapping of those issues, especially to focus on mapping all of those different types of damages that can occur and all of those different situations that did occur, and to come forward with like a proposition on how to do how to create a rule for dealing with like private internet providers and people, organizations, and countries relying on privately supplied internet. Because like from this presentation, it might seem that there is like a negative assessment of Starlink type services, which is completely not true. Like how Starlink worked in Ukraine, it changed how we perceive warfare in like a bigger picture. Because like being able to stream things from trenches basically like 24/7 live, it changed everything. Also, being able to access internet, to use it for medical part of the battlefield, to rescuing people from the battlefield, to use drones for reconnaissance and also for the offensive capabilities. It is amazing how and very surprising actually, if we look 3 to 4 years back, it is very surprising how Starlink enabled all that. And this is of course like this, in my opinion, a good change. However, there is this like unaddressed and unanalyzed gap in liability for this new type of services. And of course, everything is all of that is more interesting and more important if we put it in space. That's the space part, because under current international law, U.S. government is liable for everything that Starlink does in space, of course, and it's exclusively liable. Maybe if Starlink sent the satellites from different countries, then those countries would be liable. But at the current moment, U.S. government is liable for what Starlink does in space. It being the private company, of course, complicates everything. So yeah, that's all. I will be happy to hear all the comments you have and suggestions, because this is like a research project in progress. So I will be very happy to hear everything you have to say about it.
So, do you focus on the US law, international space law, or international humanitarian law? What's the area of law you're focused?
For US cases, US law.
US law.
Of course. For Ukrainian case, because those are the two I chose for now, because they seem most interesting. We do have international law there is a question of how a civilian in Ukraine would sue, if he wants to sue SpaceX as a Starlink as a company. It is a question how he would do that. It's a question of both like private, like local private law and private international law. There we have like a problem of US courts usually saying that they are the right jurisdiction for those cases. So this is a whole thing. So yeah, if I have to say like which branches of law are important here, is of course US law, international public law for the space stuff and the war related stuff, insurance law, international private law, and local laws of the countries that are analyzed. So for that, Ukrainian. Yeah. So a lot of different areas of law. And that's the whole point. Like the damages can differ, and the ways of the avenues of compensation can differ from like country to country, and depending on, for example, the relations of that country and US. That's also a thing. If you have like bilateral agreements for jurisdiction or whether we don't, lots of issues for that.
If you establish a duty of care under the US law, you are referring to the Texas law in contract, right?
Yes, you would have to.
And when does the duty of care happen, in your opinion?
For that, like this is analyzing like the duty of care would be important when we get to like, for example, like a negligence case in under Texas law. That's excluded. Like the whole thing is like a lower level of analysis what you are asking about.
If you don't establish duty of care under Texas law, then there's only contractual duty to Starlink. And it all according to the contract, which is capped by fees paid at 6 months at most. So what I've observed here is you are trying to establish a torts liability.
You can try. Like, but the whole problem with the agreement, how it's structured, is that you basically can't in life because the tort liability is waived, and
So
you
how do
can't
compensate. You try.
That's the whole question. Like that's the question of the whole research. How do you compensate, and how the compensation works if the contractual liability is mostly capped by those liability caps. If the tort liability is excluded, that's the question. Like, do you sue the attacker on a tort basis? That's the question also that has to be asked in that regard. And then you would be, of course, suing like usually in your jurisdiction under your law. So yeah, it depends. Like if you want to make a tort case against Starlink, you would have to do it under Texas law. But it's hard to do because it's like you could consider like you. There are types of tort liability where you can't exclude it, like a gross negligence cases. This is like a whole discourse to have, like a whole discussion. But yeah, that's a part of the research as well. How it would happen.
That's the goal of this research, trying to circumvent this contract or trying to solve the problem under Texas.
For now, the problem is to map every type of damage that can occur, and to map every way of compensation that is at least a bit viable under current legal landscape of that agreement, if you are like an individual user, like a customer.
You might take that one serious now.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Your hand up. I'm sorry, I didn't see.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I wanted to know if there was any discussion about the politics of essentially using blackouts to mask intentional political actions. Does that make any sense? So like, if I'm very blunt about it, if Elon Musk has particular political proclivities, could he mask political motives by saying, oh, there was a Starlink blackout? Is that part of the discourse? Is that something that like any of this would?
That's a problematic question.
Yeah. I agree that I'm serious.
Like in media, yeah.
Or just like people who are trying to make cases against blackouts.
Cases, no, I never seen that happen. Like in media, especially like in Poland, in Ukraine, that's for sure. It was. There were some like in the articles in like global media, in like Reuters articles. It was alleged to like there was a political background like mentioned under those like 2025 July outages. But it wasn't really like there was no like clear, of course there won't be like a clear accusation of you did it because of that. It is interesting, like that question is interesting because of the fact that you can in like a space business, in space industry, it is really hard to separate like this private company from US government.
Yeah.
Even they have like those, yeah.
Follow-up question on this. In one of the clauses specifically, it says that the government can mandate a shutdown of Starlink, and that kind of exists.
They can shut down it because of governmental order.
Yeah, so I just, from my own ignorance, I didn't understand jurisdictionally, like because SpaceX is a US company, could the US be like, you can't provide service to Ukraine or to, oh, okay.
Like whatever you understand under governmental order, like that's the whole question, like to what extent can US government limit the operations of their companies? This is also like a historical discussion. Like if we look at, I don't know, like World War II, when before the Second World War, American business was dealing a lot with Germany before 1939. And after that, it was shut down, the operation of that, also with Russia before 1939. It is like a whole, and after, of course, like a Lend-Lease, and after, yeah, it's a whole historical argument to make what, like a, it's also like not entirely historical because you have to make like what will happen, like what can happen in a hypothetical situation. But yeah, it's very interesting, and it's also like a whole, of course, like a very important political context to this whole research, of course.
Interesting.
So one idea to because I understand this project has been an early stage, so I'm giving you some ideas of where this project could go. So I would first try to separate the war cases versus more like the standard civilian situation, because these are kind of very different monsters. And then maybe later in the project you can come back and see. And then I would start with the standard civilian thing, and I could make a very clear comparison with a standard utility. Okay, if Duke Energy shut down my electricity, what is because there was a storm, they don't like people with curly hair, they receive a government order, what are my rights, do I have compensation, no? And then make like a very simple comparison. If instead of being Duke Energy is Starlink, what is the same, what is different? And that would help a lot to identify exactly what new are we talking about, what is new. And then maybe it's not Duke Energy, the right comparison is a standard internet provider maybe, or I don't know. I think it's part of the project initially to make that decision, what is the reasonable comparison. And then there we are going to start finding exactly what it is. It's like, is this a new utility that is starting? And it's very common that then the regulatory process has not fully developed yet. That's one possibility. Or it's because some particularities of the legal things of space that matters. So, or the combination. But then you are going to find also a lot of elements that are common, even with, I don't know, the small letter on liabilities. That's true pretty much every contract that you sign. Subscription on internet, buying an airplane ticket. So it's like, yeah, and there are always restrictions on liabilities, restrictions on if you want to sue, where you should go. So I think all those features are probably very similar to like, I know, a big corporation supplying something or a public utility supplying something, no? But then that will force you to identify exactly what is the particularities. So I think once you do that on a pure civilian case, then maybe you can start moving on. Okay, now we are entering more complicated territory in which there is war, there are geopolitical tensions, and then there you can study the particularities of those issues, no? So it's again exactly what adds to the standard problem that now we are considering, you know, a potential war situation, no?
Yeah, I tried to talk about it a bit because that's one of the like most important parts, to compare Starlink to something.
Yeah,
For sure. Like comparing Starlink to like regular telecommunication services, now the biggest difference is that we have very standardized standards, very set standards for telecommunication operations in different countries. You are obliged to maintain service at a certain level. There are safeties and checks and balances put on internet service providers in different countries. And also there are a lot of like public facing obligations that you have to maintain. You have to, for example, allow like military communications. You can't jam military or safety related communications and all of those, which are not present in Starlink. In Starlink, the only case which was somehow similar was when the US government tried to forced to Starlink to keep supplying the internet to Ukraine, which was like an ad hoc mechanism, which was kind of similar to this like telecommunication sector regulations. And this is like this hook. I try to, if I think about it, that there is a need for something like that, regulation of that, because we do have to sometimes, we can see already that sometimes like ad hoc mechanisms are needed for Starlink services. But there's no like standard practice or like standardized approach to regulating like a Starlink type of business in current days. But yeah, thank you very much. That's definitely very interesting question, especially this question, is this a new utility, like what Starlink provides and what Starlink does? Yeah, thank you very much.
The two of them are first. Jorge?
It's related to the same line of questions, because Starlink does use natural disaster settings and being able to establish service during at scale natural disasters as part of one of the benefits of using Starlink. And then you end up with a company that, from what you presented earlier, has very difficult way of being able to hold liable.
Yeah.
And that by extension could be shut down by order of another government. And once you establish a connection in a place, that place tends to rely on that connection, especially if you're in rural or hard to access areas. So it's not so much a question as it is a concern of if that can be mapped. That would be interesting, and how that has played out and how that could be some potential leverage over those entire areas that rely on that service.
I thought about that exact thing yesterday. Did some digging, because that was my first thought, that okay, they are advertising, supplying to like Ukraine and countries in natural crisis and everything, and actually they don't do that much. Like they are very particular in the language of their advertisement and how they approach those situations. Not to say anything like, for example, we will help your country in a case of natural disaster. And like, we will provide internet to your people. Like they're very particular not to do anything that is like remotely tied to those types of statements. For example, like because they don't, I guess they don't want to cause like unfair market practice accusations that they're lying about it, and there's no way of exactly what you said, like executing those statements. However, they are gaining like maybe not straight monetary advantage from that, but they are gaining like a public and marketing advantage from supplying to those countries and being in media as the company that supplies internet to those countries in need. So indirectly they do gain from that, but I don't think I have to dig more into that, but I thought about it. And what I search for now, like what I research for now, they are very particular in their language not to say anything like that in marketing. Because that's exactly,
So a couple of comments. One for the liability, it's actually interesting. I didn't think of it before your comment. So generally, yes, the US has the liability for what space companies do, but those other and part of it are even like strict liabilities. So there are two types. But when those articles were written, they envisioned like satellite crashing. They didn't envision public service like that. So I'm not even sure it applies. So this is a question in itself. Are the liability rules that I meant for a hard hit also apply for something like that? And then when you talk about the third liability, then there are the exceptions of majeure, and maybe there wasn't even negligence because so I mean, which is another thing that we need to prove, and war exclusion, which brings us to the question of insurance, and we talked a few days ago, and I can share with you the draft article that Scott and I and Nick Saunders from Viasat wrote about insurance of insurance coverage for damages from cyber attack on space systems, and whether or not the government should kind of step in, because and it depends who did the attack. But if the attack is part of a war, then the company wasn't part of the war. War is usually associated with the state, so it's the state who created the risk, and there are many precedents that the state undertakes the risk. So if a private company or a private citizen was harmed by an act of war, it is the state who cover that. Here it's actually even more complicated because it is American company, but the war is not an American war. It's like it's a war with Ukraine. And another issue is who did the attack or the disruption. It can be a criminal or all the things that, like what Gustavo says, a civilian. It could be an act of war, for example, by Russia, but it can also be your own state that does the shutdown. And again, here it's even more complicated because it can be either the US telling Starlink to cut the service for a few hours or not, but it can also be Ukraine government that does it as preemptive, whatever does that. So you have here multiple elements, and of course you cannot address them all, but just wanted to put it inside. But very interesting topic and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's definitely one of the most important issues. Also, like the space. This is like two most important like regulatory international law related issues. Is first thing is that it is in space, and then now we have this whole space law thing, and the other thing is that this whole space law thing was created in like 70s, and when like 2, 3, or 5 states were able to send something to the space, and now many countries can do, and many private companies are developing capabilities to do so. Also, adding to that, the cyber attack on the space infrastructure is a whole other issue. We can see like this is just me thinking about those issues. We can see a very, in my opinion, troubling pattern with like international humanitarian law having problem with cyber attacks overall. Like it is, we had a definition of an armed conflict, of right for self-defense and everything for years and years. And now, in my opinion, what is done in things like Tallinn manuals and all of this like international humanitarian law doctrine, those things should amount, like those cyber attacks should amount to armed attacks, like under like direct application of those rules. If we give like a non-lawyer person who first time sees that those definitions, yeah, of course, they turned off the electricity in the hospital. Of course, it's an armed attack. And we don't do that because there is the amount of cyber attacks, the scale of cyber warfare currently is so vast that we would have like a World War III if we say that this is an armed attack. So we just try to think of ways to avoid that. It's very similar here. Like if we put cyber attacks in a space context, we have the same problem. We have definitions and legal acts from 70s, like 1972, I think. And now we have to somehow adapt those regulations that were meant for physical attacks and for like Cosmos 951, the cases where the satellites collided and all of those types of cases. And now we have to include like I don't know, 13-year-old with $50 buying malware to hack a Starlink satellite. Yeah, that's definitely.
Maybe one more comment. Russia and China don't like to talk about cyber warfare. They usually talk about cyber crime.
Yeah,
almost denying that there is such a thing as cyber warfare. So that's another element.
Exactly. And we have like groups like APT groups. Yeah, like what I was talking to Gustavo, I think 2 weeks ago. So like advanced persistent threat groups, which are groups of people who are somehow tied to governments of the different countries. Like we have operational knowledge that kind of attribute their actions to a certain government, but we cannot do like a proper international law attribution of their action, and they operate in this like state non-state kind of situation. So yeah, there's tons of problems. Thank you very much.
I think I want to go back to what I've heard from several people, but anchor it with Gustavo was talking about. I think you have so much going on right now that I'm a lawyer and I'm not convinced you're covering the laws that I expect to hear. And that's a problem because I think you are. I just don't think the responses are coming in that way. So, you know, there are, and there have historically been differences between acts of war, acts of genocide. I mean, those things are. And so my question is very similar to Gustavo, is what's different because it's a satellite than if it's a cut underground cable, than if it's a situation where I stop food supplies coming in. You know, we have, and when you put up a whole group of contract clauses, I immediately start thinking of force majeure, acts of war, back to the shipping times. This was all claused out. And law came in and said, you can't clause all of this out. You cannot just relinquish all that. You can just not say, oops, our bad. It's a rough world, deal with it, and clause everything out. So, you know, I really do think you need to do something that anchors us with all the law that it is that you're contemplating, so that the lawyers in the room can sort of go, hold on, you've at least envisioned the possibilities of what you're talking about. And therefore now I'm going to show you how there are gaps. Mm-hmm. Because right now I'm not convinced. Mm-hmm. I'm not convinced. We have tons of international law and law in the United States that says foreign actions of an American in a foreign country that results in harm is actually capable of being pursued. We don't like it. We don't prefer not to use it, but we absolutely hold corporations responsible for harms caused abroad. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Why would it be different if it is in the Ukraine than it is in a satellite in space, when the harm is caused locally? And you haven't convinced me what the difference is. Just because we're using a satellite to facilitate the communication, the harm is still caused here. That's jurisdiction. The location of the harm is the jurisdiction. It also oftentimes gives me both the location of the corporation law and the location of the harm.
Mhm.
So you haven't convinced me yet that the satellite changes these scenarios. And I think you're probably right. Please understand. You just haven't convinced me how this is fundamentally different, because we're throwing the communication through a satellite versus all the other places that have been under attack to prevent communication during a wartime effort, or things that are not wartime, but are nonetheless interference with the communication of an entity that we identify as an enemy. And we absolutely hold corporations, responsible for those type of acts. And, you know, my pushback is, I mean, for people in the room who know me well, yeah, I'm tired of tech people being able to pretend like, because it's technology, we've cracked the word. Nobody's ever thought of this before. That's crap. I'm tired of that being the standard argument. They are a corporation. They have the same responsibilities. And if they've incorporated Texas law into things, suffer at the hands of that dumbass decision. There's public policy that says you cannot just, we're not liable for anything. Too bad you signed up. We have telecoms law. We have all kinds. So you're going to have to put it in front of me to convince me that that's not where I should be looking for as the first resource or port of call, just because the communication flips through a satellite. And I think that's where you start. I think you're hearing it from several people, but maybe they haven't really put it together but that's what Gustavo was, lay these things together and tell me what's different. And my guess is there is something different. I just don't know what it is. But until you convince me of that, it's a corporate actor causing harm in another country. You bet we have laws that prevent that and hold them accountable. And the corporations don't like it, but it doesn't mean that it's not the law.
Just one, and then other countries can do the same. It's like, just protect their own users. It's like, I don't care if it's coming from the space or your customers are here, and then
Here's the harm.
you are liable.
The harm right there. There's the body laying somewhere on the earth. That is the harm.
So what I think in that case,
May I interrupt?
oh, sorry.
It's another person before.
Fine. No, sorry.
I tied him in. The directors all line each other in. We know each other too well.
Just a small suggestions follow up. So if you want to look into international obligations, you might distinguish international humanitarian law from international human rights law.
Yeah.
Because humanitarian law goes to the belligerent groups, but human rights law applies to civilian lives all the time. There is wartime or not.
Yep.
So it's a more strict obligations.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
like coming back to the Angie's comment about that, like it is like my question maybe is a bit different. Maybe I didn't state that part correctly, because I did with the discussion we had with Eitan last week, and maybe I should have started more with that, like a perspective of whom I'm taking in this research.
Yeah.
I am not interested in whether the company can be liable, because I assume it can. I know it can be liable for those actions. I am interested in what I, as a civilian in this country, like a one person who is affected by some sort of an outage on the Starlink part, what can I do about it? Like where do I have to go with, and what do I have to write in my like, yes, what will be the basis on which I can get compensation for the harm that was done to me as an individual, like a one person? Because like a global level, I agree that there are bases for countries suing other countries and countries being liable for Starlink's action. That's, as I also said that at some point, I think that on the basis of space law, the US will be liable for Starlink's action. On the basis of humanitarian law, it will be liable under 91 or Article 91 of Additional Protocol 1 to Geneva Conventions, I think. And on like a regular basis, they will be liable probably under articles on state responsibility. Yeah. It is that part is clear. The part is, in my opinion, which is not clear, is how me as an individual, because space law answer for that is that your government has to do it for you.
There's a lot of things that are that way.
Yeah.
That the government has to
That's
do.
true.
Yep,
And
there's a lot of stuff that.
what I'm interested in is like whether the answer to that question at the like later stage, at like the final answer to that is that you won't get a compensation for that. And we just don't have any basis for like effective compensation for outages of this type of service.
Yeah, but what's different between that than air pollution that the government also has to protect me from? So that's a fundamental policy
yeah.
side question.
Yeah,
Those are the places you should be looking at, in my opinion, to come to what the question is. Why in some instances do I, as an individual who's been harmed, have to beg my government to stand up for me? There's a lot of situations where that is in fact the case. And there'll be which is not my area, but there'll be tons of research of why that decision is made and why it's not made in other decisions. And so that's part of what I'm pushing back on, is you haven't set this up in a way that someone who understands the nuances of that stuff understand why this should be different.
Yeah.
Because air pollution as well.
Yeah, like environmental law, probably.
Yeah. So let me suggest a simple idea here. So essentially, if you are, let's say that you are a US customer, and then you suffer a shutdown of Starlink, okay? Then one possibility is you go through the contract and you go to Texas arbitration, blah, blah, okay? Your other option is you just sue, saying, it could be even a class action in which you say that this contract that, yes, I signed, but violates the Telecommunication Act of the US. And then you just go to the court. So the court says that there are some pieces of that contract that are not valid. And then if you're a citizen in Canada, you do the same thing, but with the Canadian version of the Telecommunication Act in Canada. And then you say, yes, I am just a user of a communication service, and I have these rights. And then it doesn't matter what the contract says. The contract is not valid because violates the National Telecommunication Act. And then I think and then in those cases, in those lawsuits, I understand that potentially government agencies could be part of those lawsuits, essentially. That would be the standard thing in other industries, no? I would say.
Last question.
Last question, just to build on this, it might be helpful in terms of like setting up the framing that I think folks are kind of arriving at, that would be helpful, like what is different about this, is also what are the range of ways in which citizens have been able to do this in relevant comparative context. And I don't just mean like what are the bases on which, like, what's a story about someone who was harmed by an international actor in a particular jurisdiction that has the similar kinds of complexities here, but is in maybe a relevant comparative industry, so that you can really elucidate if or how this is different, what the tools are they use in that, and whether or not. Because then I think you can have a benchmark that will help do the thing that Angie is suggesting, while also sort of figure out which of the things that Gustavo is talking about are relevant for the story that you're telling.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that this idea of like comparing energy industry, regular telecommunication, this is like the best idea. Yeah.
Keep with it. You're right where you should be. In case we don't say that often enough, you're right where you should be, thinking through all this stuff and having people go, what about this? And you're like, let's think about it. It's right where you should be. So congratulations. You've absorbed go with a lot of information. Not the word I was gonna use.
Being transcribed, I would love to see that transcribed.